So yeah, welcome back. It's been a while since we talked, but it feels like this is a kind of a moment of, well, it is a moment of crisis. It doesn't feel like it's a moment of crisis. And I wanted
Yeah.
to get your thoughts on one particular piece of the crisis that I'm directly involved in helping to kind of organize around, which is precarious academic labor.
Yeah.
This is, yeah, there's multiple strikes happening just here in Halifax alone. But, there's been labor actions all across North America. And I guess I wanted to maybe frame the discussion really quickly by talking about Canada specifically. So, like, roughly 10 years ago, actually 9 years ago, CCPA put out this big study of precarious academic work, pointing out that, like, across Canada, more than half of all faculty appointments are contract.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a big difference in discipline, 39% in science, half in social sciences, almost 60% in the humanities. So, I mean, what kinds of labor are being valued here? Quebec seems to rely far more than other provinces on part-time labor, 61% in 2016. And, there are 13 universities where two-thirds of all the faculty appointments are part-time. And yet we have to fight tooth and nail for any sort of like dignified labor or, I think a lot of part-time academics talk about like just feeling exploited, right? So
Yeah.
could you maybe unpack this exploitation from like that structural perspective and maybe talk about your own like personal experiences in this sector?
Yeah. Yeah. I always think about a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who is the head of a department when I was at Ryerson, which is, of course, now Toronto Metropolitan University. And he was saying, like, the economics of this whole model don't make any sense because if you're able to pay someone $3,000 to $5,000 for a course, why would you ever waste your money on a faculty member that might not be teaching more than one class?
Hmm.
And this is where it's kind of like a drug, right? Once you start relying on it,
Hmm.
you need to rely on it more and more and more, and you get used to needing it. And all of a sudden, the whole system is actually so, dependent on these workers that it has been completely transformed. And so it's driven by underfunding. Underfunding triggers managers within these institutions to say, well, we can't afford a professor, but we got to teach these classes. So let's go ahead and teach, with the cheapest labor possible. And you talked about which, like, sectors are more devalued. There's for sure a value statement on like more sessional workers in the humanities than in, let's say, science. But there's also another reason for that, which is just that the humanities, and let's not like forget business is also included in that too, the massive business
Hmm.
schools, right?
Hmm.
They're cheap. They're cheap. My partner is a professor of chemistry. There is a limit to how many students you can get into a program that relies on benches and labs and, materials to do your research. Business, communications, sociology, none of this stuff relies on physical materials and physical space. So you build the extra enormous classrooms. Your justification for an extra enormous classroom is that you have all these TAs doing all of this other work while the professor's teaching, up to, in the case of the University of Toronto, up to 1,000 and more students. And that's the educational experience all of a sudden. So, this is what has been deemed for many decades now the neoliberal university. And as you experience, as you know, as you're fighting for better working conditions, you can see very, very clearly that not only do we have like the worst people in management in our institutions, like the least talented and the worst humans in general, but they also like absolutely will not fight for a system that will be improved by notably public funding, right? Every time tuition fees go up, every time we rely more on student debt, public funding goes down. And that quality change, it completely it fundamentally alters how people understand what even is the role of the university. And so that's basically why we've been
Hmm.
thrown into this mess.
Yeah, that's a perfect kind of historical overview, right? This like transformative neoliberal logic that no one even had to invent, just sort of descends on the university and cannibalizes it in a way and turns it into this just race to the bottom, focus on financialization. And I guess like since you've written these two books with Dundurn Press, is it Dundurn Press? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, on basically like financialization and corporate capture, I guess, I wanted to kind of unpack that a little bit because like,
Yeah.
in this struggle, I, you know, obviously I'm sympathetic to folks like you and others who like are trying to deconstruct and in many ways just indict the system of financializing everything. What would you tell somebody that doesn't have that like language of
Yeah.
financialization of even capitalism, like talking about capitalism? What would you tell that person is at stake when it comes to like the future of education and this dream of like sending your kids to like university, etc.? Like what is what is different now, given the nature of hyper financialization of the university, do you
Yeah.
think?
So like the higher education, has always been connected to job training, especially at the college level, but it isn't just about job training, right? This hits us at a time in our lives where we are just coming out of the home for the first time. Or if you're a mature student, you're going back after some major life thing, right? Something has
Mm-hmm.
made you go, I want to change careers, I want a PhD, I want to try something new, right? So these are
Totally.
very important social locations. These are very important
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
gathering spaces. They're very important places for you to meet new people and to develop networks that then actually continue to follow you for the rest of your life. Um, if it's the first time you've left home, if it's not the first time you've left home, but because you actually go to school in the town that you grew up in, these institutions play many different roles. And so there's the whole social construction role of this class of people will always know each other. They partied together and they will move together in their careers and they will know each other, right? I know people from Ryerson, from journalism, who are now some of the biggest journalists in Canada and North America. It's like kind of crazy, right? That's one of
Mm-hmm.
the things that these schools give you. The
Yeah,
other thing is that they give the communities that they're located in industry. Like it's as
that's
simple
right.
as that. It's just a big employer where
Yeah.
lots of people work there, lots of people run food services, the mailroom, custodial services, teaching, management, administration, all of this stuff, right? And so like on that side, then you have a really important economic engine in these communities that employs people, that gives people a salary, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when we look at the higher education system and rather than saying, let's make it more like high school, not the actual experience or the quality, but we'll make it fully funded, we'll make it free, and we'll make it universally accessible to people like high school. And we'll give people the economic freedom to just study. That creates a very different situation than if you say, no, let's do the opposite. Let's make them pay for it. Let's devalue the education, not in the sense of like my education is like financially valuable, but let's make it so easy or so cheap that you're not really getting much out of it. Plus, you have to work three jobs. So the whole social side of it's out the window because you're still trying to maintain, your own ability to pay rent, or maybe you're supporting a family or whatever. And then it becomes like, well, I just have to get through this. This sucks. It's gonna be 4 years of my life. I'm not gonna spend any time on campus. I'm not gonna actually do what the university is there for, which is I'm entering on a very narrow interest. That interest is going to be blown open by learning all of the things around that interest in the field that I've chosen. Maybe you're at a school like I was, where you were then also forced to take classes completely outside of your field, which was wonderful. And then if you're the kind of nerd that's like, I want to keep learning, which is not everybody, then you get really narrow into something and try to discover new kinds of knowledge to advance something that will help society. That's the
The
promise
greatest.
of higher
Yeah.
education, right?
Yeah.
We're so far away from that promise being what drives decision makers. Because if you were
Mm.
to be driven by the promise of higher education and the beauty that it can give to average people across society, regardless of how much money they have, then you would say, let's fund this like high school. And instead, you're like, no, let's make the experience terrible. Let's destroy student life. Let's destroy student partying. Let's just destroy, and this is very important, autonomous student organizing, which has always been a feature of higher education. And then
Yeah.
you say, well, there's no autonomous student organizing. There's no radical students that have the resources and the structures to be able to be radical. We're going to leave this up to the unions, which of course are completely limited in how radical they can be because they're unions and they're subject to labor legislation and deadlines and strike mandates and votes and general meetings and all
Mm.
that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the university administration just like, sweet,
Yeah.
we got nothing to worry about.
It's like the system is chilling itself. We're good.
Hmm.
And I worry right now, from what I understand, the student union at the university I work for, it has not expressed solidarity with the strike. And there's who knows why, right?
Yeah.
But you can speculate that it is precisely a symptom of what you're describing, right? Where the things that the left sometimes calls for unions to do, so like engage in struggles beyond the search for like dignified, equitable labor and participate in peace activism, for example, environmental activism, etc. Like those things are unthinkable because of this like slow attenuation, I think, of organized labor and also these constraints that you're talking about. I kind of wanted you to maybe expand on something that you said earlier about management, about the lack
Yeah.
of talent in management, because like I saw you talk to the New Brunswick Media Co-op, I think, about your books, your recent books, and you talked about this really brilliantly. And I think it's Marco Irabo or somebody who talks about like sleepwalking elites, right? The people who are in positions of power are maybe unprecedentedly incompetent, especially in terms of like their practical knowledge of how to get things done, their capacity, I think, for like collective work, like working with others, and then
Yeah.
this like real like a kind of cynical lack of any real vision, right? Like a material vision. um how does that like how does that manifest itself both at the level of management and in some cases at the level of like other elite institutions? Like where do we see that in Canada, and what are its effects for regular people, you know?
This is like this I think is actually the biggest crisis in Canada, other than the crises like, climate crisis and war and
Hmm. Hmm.
profiteering. Those are like the big things that are driving the crises in Canada, but it's all made possible by like an incredible incompetence at managerial levels across the board. And I'm not sure what is the driver. I think there's going to be many drivers behind this, but if you take an institution, for example, it isn't as if the most capable people are the ones who rise through the ranks because they're capable, and eventually the provost is the person that has had a ton of experience in a lot of different ways, and they were good at research and they were good at teaching and they're good at, being a good colleague, and therefore their colleagues rewarded them by pushing them up the hierarchy. No, what they actually do is they look around to see who's hiring. They discover there's a crisis at the University of Regina. They take the person that caused the crisis there and they put them at Dalhousie, and then they're like, oh my God, it was a crisis. And that's how it's been for decades, right?
It's bonkers, yeah.
It is bonkers. And on the left, it's easy to see how it happens on the left, right? I
Mm,
am the president of the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, which is a tiny, tiny research think tank. And I can tell
mhm,
you, even in this tiny research think tank, to just see management and the difficulty that this organization has had with management for many, many years, it's really fascinating, which makes sense because it's a bunch of researchers. Who the hell needs to manage, right? We're doing
mm,
research, right?
mm,
And to try and bring sense to even a tiny place like this, or when I was very young as a manager at the Ryerson Students Union, right? 20 years old, and I'm managing a multi-million dollar corporation with many, many staff, many full-time unionized staff and part-time staff. There are certain skills that you have to learn in hand-to-hand combat.
mm,
You cannot learn in the classroom. This is why, like, the self-made man comes into business when he's 16 years old and learns how to work with people and learns how to manage. The guy might be an
mm,
asshole, but he's probably effective at being a manager. And we have completely devalued that. And also, I think partly it might be related to the fact that Canada really is a branch plant company, and so we also just outsource management too. Like, it comes from us on high,
mm.
and we don't need to develop systems of excellent management. That happens in the private sector. It happens
Interesting.
okay and well and poorly in the private sector, but in the public sector, it is like across the board bad.
Mm,
Add to that the political appointments that then get layered on top of bad management that are politically appointed by provinces, through orders in council to make the board of governors or make the hospital board or make the board that manages whatever city service that we're talking about. And then you have the political patronage thing, which is deeply Canadian. Canadians love patronage, and people are
mhm,
getting appointed because they're like, the mother-in-law of this member of parliament or of this local
Just
representative,
straight
right?
nepotism, yeah.
It's total nepotism. So there's
Hmm.
a bunch of things at play. And ultimately, what happens, and you can see it the clearest, I think, in organizations like a university because they are very hierarchical. And it's hard to imagine how to organize a massive institution without a level of hierarchy because, then it might be these little units that are semi-autonomous and they're all working together. That could be interesting. But a school that's managing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets and all of these people and all of the physical plant, you're going to have certain people who are more competent than others. But as you continue to rise through the ranks, those jobs become worse and worse and worse. And so the best professors absolutely do not want to go higher. They want to keep doing what they're doing. The best researchers aren't necessarily the best teachers. And that creates a bit of a clash within the university system when you're trying to make money off of the teaching. You can't make money off of the research in the same way. And so there's a bottleneck with professoriate where the best researchers every minute they're teaching they're not doing the research. And so that's something you have to manage. That's a tension within the institutions they have to manage. But if you're not talented, you're not going to manage that tension and you're going to create another crisis, which is really what we've seen happening in these yeah, exactly, in these cycles.
Man, oh man. Yeah, that's a brilliant analysis. It just reminds me that, like, you know, yes, managers are people, but they of course exist within the system that is channeling them in certain directions. And,
Hmm.
where they land is a position where there must be tons of cognitive dissonance where, like,
Totally.
what is dangerous seems safe because it's conventional. What is, risk aversion might be risky in the long term, but it's just the way things are done. We have to avoid risk as much as possible. And it's just have this ossified kind of like reality, right? And
Totally.
the union that I'm part of, and other people, are I think kind of almost waking up to, right? Because it's only in the context often of a strike, of a labor action
Yeah.
that like you even become aware of your own collective power. I think, what we're realizing is that there is this profound inequality, not just in terms of pay, but also in terms of how our labor is valued and recognized. Like look at, the way that course evaluations are deployed to make
Yeah.
people who are already precarious more precarious, right? These are some of the key struggles, but we can't get even past the wage question because we're in this time of like austerity where the notion, our banker in chief is talking about spending less and investing more, and like nobody knows what that means. So what I like about your perspective, and I didn't know you had that role at CCPA. That's awesome.
Yes.
Is like you're looking because their documents are often about trying to propose obviously policy alternatives, like practical
Yeah.
ways forward. And so I'm interested to hear you maybe speak to like how that organization and maybe unions equally are attempting to find some kind of compromise, I guess, right? Between the radical, what's called radical, right? And the conservative. Something more akin to like the center, even though that's a slur, that's a bad word.
Hmm.
Like we're in some sense trying to make it common sense that like education should not be riddled with anxiety, right?
Yeah.
And can you maybe talk about like how CCPA is thinking now, 9 years after this landmark report, about how to basically replace this language of resilience, like just be resilient, right? Be a
Hmm.
resilient gig worker with something a little bit more dignified and stable and, like how you're arguing for that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, CCPA, its strength is in its research, and the research is a little
Yeah.
bit impersonal, right? It is research. And
Yeah.
I think that the role of an organization like the CCPA in Canada is to give the research for then the activists, the unions, the social movement organizations to say, well, here's what the facts say, and we're gonna fluff up the facts with some anecdotes and some dreaming and some thought experiments, right?
Mm.
I think one of the things for me that just kind of it makes me just so happy to be in this role. It is a volunteer role, so I have to say it's a bit of a pain in my ass, but it's a fun pain in my ass. But it was the CCPA that first. It was CCPA's research, Hugh Mackenzie's research, decades and decades and decades ago, that first made me understand how higher education could be free. And I started school in 2003. I think my tuition fees that year were $4,000, which was a lot of money, but it wasn't what it is today. And I had been working from the age of 13 or 14, so 13. So I mean, for me, the money was a lot, but it wasn't insurmountable because I had been working and then I became a church organist. And then all of a sudden you're making $50 an hour when you're 17, right? So it's like I was pretty lucky
Sweet.
in a
Yeah.
very weird way, right?
It's a weird gig,
But
but it sounds like a
super
good one.
weird gig, and we could do a whole episode on what it's like to be the director of music at a Catholic church at that age, which was pretty fun in some ways. The realization for me that education could be free, and listening to this presentation that Hugh Mackenzie had developed on all the numbers, this was what allowed me to dream. And so if you sit in a meeting with CCPA researchers, there's certainly, I mean, these people are not robots, like they're all really great activists too, and so there is a bit of dreaming, but at the end of the day it's like, no, the balance sheet has to make sense, the numbers have to make sense, we have to be able to explain how this works, right? And armed with that, as a member of the board of governors at Ryerson, I was able to say, like, look, what we can actually remix our own numbers. We can completely deconstruct our own budget. And so we did that once at Ryerson. We took the university's deferred surplus, which they didn't call deferred surplus, it had a fancier name. And we were able to say, look, like you can not only not raise tuition fees this year, but you also could do all of these things with this deferred surplus and also not make all the departments angry by spending their money, quote unquote. And that exercise raised so much confidence among the student activists around us, and it raised confidence among the faculty who were with us on the board of governors too, because they were not part of a movement. Like the faculty on the
Sure.
board of governors at the time we were there understood who they were there for. They weren't hacks, which was really lucky,
Mm.
but they weren't connected to a movement. So they're there trying to do their best, listening to the arguments and be kind of fair about this. I think, as you say, find that center, because they weren't really pushing for a radical
Sure.
change, but they didn't want to see the students get screwed either. And we
Hmm.
managed to turn everyone's heads around so much with our arguments, thanks really to the inspiration of what was being done at the CCPA with the alternative federal budget, that we almost won a vote because, and this goes back to the weakness of management, which then becomes a bit of a strength for activists because we can exploit it. There's so many people on the board of governors that literally had no idea. And when you place the numbers in front of them and say, this is the decision that we can make, and it won't impact this, it won't do this, it'll mean this, it'll mean that, they'll go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then all of a sudden it has to be a recess call, and people have to go, no, no, you're supposed to vote this way. And they're like, oh shit, sorry about that. I screwed that up. Right. And this is what I think what's really important for activists to always know. Like, we have to be over prepared. We have to have the most
Yeah.
solid numbers and research. And that's where you go to groups like the CCPA or other groups doing really wonderful research. And then you have to have the arguments that transcend the numbers, that don't
Mm.
count on the numbers. Because if you don't have both, then you're not necessarily able to exploit the fact that there are idiots amongst us, and you can convince them of certain things if you make the right arguments, right? So I think that's what unions have to seek to do. And it's asking a lot of unions, because a lot of our unions just do not have the capacity. And I think it's important to say that. But
Hmm.
it is their work, it is their reason to exist, to render things visible that seem impossible.
Hmm.
And as you say, at a moment of struggle, that's the
Hmm.
best time, because you've captured audience, they're on the picket line physically, and they actually be together. But if we're not able to imagine getting ourselves out of this mess, then we will absolutely not get out of this mess. You can only
Hmm.
get out of the mess by fighting towards or working towards a vision. But if you haven't developed what that vision is, then you're really dead in the water before you've started.
Hmm.
And fleshing out that vision, that collective work, which is fun actually, does require a lot of different inputs that mean we have to be more sophisticated than our enemies, which I think in a lot of parts on the left we're frankly we're not.
Hmm. Yeah, no. A lot of work needs to be done, and it's a question of, I think, resources, but it's also a question of like sort of like resolve. Like once you
Yeah.
resolve to almost like find each other, that's when things become possible, and that's what I'm seeing,
Yeah.
right now, and it's encouraging because I think the future is still struggle. When you
Yes.
think about the way that these sleepwalking elites are embracing AI, for example, it's just like, what are we doing, right? And that is, to me, we don't can't even really get into that, but like that is another frontier of struggle, even and especially within the university, where they're seeing the erosion of certain skills because of these large language models, this generative AI problem, but they're not yet thinking about what it's going to do in terms of teaching, right?
Yeah.
And you look at certain creative industries like, the SAG-AFTRA strike, and there was like a concerted effort to provide both the quantitative and qualitative data around why AI, for example, undermines something pretty integral,
Yes.
to who we are as people, right? The ability to like tell stories and like, create art. These intangible things that are worth
Hmm.
defending, you know?
Hmm.
Anyway, to be continued. I
Yeah.
really appreciate you making the time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I really wanted to get your perspective on this current moment generally and the more particular
Mm-hmm.
local struggles over, in a sense, on the one hand, this part-time precarious academic labor that, universities in Canada rely on
Mm-hmm.
extensively. This is the reason I really wanted to kind of get your perspective, though, is that you've written and researched social movements for so long, and you have this deep investment in the radical imagination as a site of both, struggle, but also of this kind of terrain of social innovation and all this exciting stuff. The There's been a long attack on labor in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can look back to like the National Day of Protest against wage controls in 1976, the Solidarity Movement in British Columbia in the 1980s, the Ontario Days of Action in the
Mm-hmm.
1990s, um, as examples of people really rising up to challenge that attack on labor,
Mm-hmm.
on organized labor. Can you just begin? I mean, you're a professor at Mount Saint Vincent, where there is currently a
Mm-hmm.
labor action among
There
part-time
is.
instructors. I am one of them,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I wanted you to start by hopefully connecting this struggle with this larger context of growing inequality, intensifying anxiety, and
Mm.
just like the bigger picture of what's at stake in terms of this specific struggle in relationship to others.
I mean, those are amazing questions. I'd probably be lying if I said I had, satisfying answers to any of them, but I will definitely give it a shot. I mean, I think the way you frame that historically is incredibly important, and I think that is one of the big questions that's been on my mind lately. Like, where is that large scale grassroots, really vigorous pushback from working people and their organizations against what seems to be like an awfully effective attack on working people's power by capital. And I think where we're seeing that, perhaps not surprisingly in the Canadian context anyway, is in some of our most sort of public facing, still mostly public institutions. So Canada Post, we're seeing this, the universities, public schools, a variety of institutions that were kind of part of that whole package of creating a Canadian state and uh, and thinking about what it meant to distinguish a genuinely Canadian sort of nationalism from our southern neighbors. All these like institutions came up in response to that at that time, and again in that sort of spirit of a more collective, less aggressively individualistic form of capitalism, right? And I mean, I could tell this story again about the kind of the détente that existed in the 50s and through most of the 60s between organized labor and capital and how that's off the table now. But I don't think anybody really needs to hear that story. I do think what we're seeing now is um, kind of the consequences of a long-term agenda. Some people would call it austerity. I just think it's the logical consequences of neoliberalism, really, of capitalism and neoliberalism. And I actually am probably one of those voices, and maybe it's simply because I've sat in a department chair position for too long, but I have sympathy for the managers at the level of universities in Canada. I think they take a lot of flack, but I think the reality is that even if we liquidated our administrative class and redistributed their wages to workers, we wouldn't find that we could actually hire that many more people. That's the situation we're in is one where these institutions have been squeezed so aggressively and have been so comprehensively defunded. Uh, and the tax base simply, no longer exists as a result of incredible gifts to the richest in our society who pay far less than their share. That I think what we're seeing is this really ugly manifestation of individualized workplace struggles that are really kind of segregated from one another, that are treated as individual eruptions of dissent, no matter how appropriate, but that don't really are not coming together to kind of coalesce into a larger movement, building that kind of anger, hope, sense of possibility forward in these moments. And I mean, I say that as somebody who was on strike too at this institution a couple of years ago and very similar feelings about it. I think the academic case, I think, is very particular um, for reasons that we could definitely get into. The university is a pretty medieval institution. A lot of its like processes and ranks and protections are kind of bizarre unless we remember that, there was like monks with quill and ink who were originally staffing these places. So I can, I mean, we're kind of talking about a very unique workplace situation in some ways when we think about how capitalism works today. And I think a lot of people outside of that context, don't understand that. But in a lot of ways, that doesn't matter. Each workplace is specific. This kind of like thorough degradation of the wherewithal of the institutions to actually meet not only demands from the workers who make them happen, but also to respond effectively to kind of the demands of their constituencies. Like, I want my mail delivered to my house. I want to not sit for 70 hours in an ER waiting to be seen. I want education that is accessible and is engaging, timely, important, and will help me uplift my social circumstance. All of these things are starting actually to fall away in the face of simply like this idea of either it's the institution, however impoverished, will be there or it won't. And that's sort of the choice increasingly, it seems, that we're being presented with as citizens in one of the richest, most technologically advanced nations on the planet. This is a generalized condition, I think, and it really is um, I think, a very demoralizing position for ordinary folks to find themselves in, whether they're in a workplace situation where they're on strike or prepared to go on labor action, or if they're not even unionized and have no possibility of that and are simply bystanders. I think we're, to my mind right now, we're stuck in a bit of a ritual of dissent that has become almost I mean, as lots of radicals would probably say far better than me, like the processes of contract negotiation, conventional labor unionism, under the current, I think, architecture of this crumbling
Mhm.
capitalist world order are no longer sufficient to deliver the goods anymore. And we're really seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch there to unpack. Um, and it feels like a couple recurrent things that you're drawing attention to is that, and where you landed is this question of the architecture. Is there any sort of like social architecture that can incubate linked struggles? Because I mentioned, the point of struggle, often in these situations, you don't know what you're struggling for, who you're struggling against. There isn't internal communication and cohesion. And to your point, like you perhaps are creating a straw man to some extent of management, and you don't, it's difficult to
Hmm.
even come to a compromise because you're not you're not clear on what the vision for that compromise is.
Hmm.
But I wanted to pick up on the question of like tactics, right? Because movement-based worker organizations typically use less conventional political tactics, right? Direct action
Hmm.
strategies, mass mobilization. Those are the strategies. Are you suggesting that maybe right now we need to really reflect critically on like what the tactics are,
Hmm.
given the fact that like, the left will just say unions need to be more involved in like the climate
Hmm.
emergency. They need to be,
Hmm.
better activists when it comes to Palestine. But there doesn't seem to be that understanding of where the like what I'm calling social infrastructure, the
Hmm.
networks seem to be kind of like crumbling. How do we kind of, I don't know, shift our tactics without losing, I guess, that really important focus on like the actual practical wins that we need in the short
Hmm.
term for our members,
Yeah, I mean that is like that's the horns of the dilemma that we are currently gored on, I think, in so many ways. This, on the one hand, I think what we have, as you so well described, is this legacy of in some places, at least, certainly for some unions more than others, but broadly speaking, especially a lot of unions that were involved or are involved in public service delivery of various kinds have this fairly radical grassroots tradition, interested in intersecting with other uh, working people's organizations and other activists, social justice struggles. This comes out of a long legacy of seeing these struggles connected, of building power this way. But I think, like decades ago now, when I was doing my dissertation research on the Zapatistas and their connection with activists in other parts of the world, I remember having a great interview with a CUPW activist and organizer in Ottawa by the name of Dave Bleakney. And at the time, Dave told me, because I asked him, I was like, what is it about the Zapatistas' tactics that struck you as particularly interesting and innovative? What lessons can we learn? And again, this was, at least 2.5 decades ago, like 25 years ago, when I was doing this. And he said to me, he's like, there was a time when getting 10,000 people in the street would get the attention of power holders. Um, but now we see, certainly after the Iraq war mobilization, which again was like 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. But even since then, we have seen the conspicuous, dedicated, and spectacular mobilization of masses of people um, that has amounted, unfortunately, I think, to very little in terms of the political effect it generates. And I think we need to look at that hard. I think we need to look at the question of what does power mean in this moment? How can we exercise it effectively? And what are we trying to win? I think those questions are need to be more front and center. And I know certainly in my own experience as a white collar uh, labor uh, organizer, activist, whatever I am in the context of my own union, I can also say there's a super big problem with the fact that many of our enduring organizations continue to protect classes of workers who have a good deal of protection already and are enjoying the best fruits of that. So my own, my faculty association, I respect and honor the work of all the activists in it who are doing their best to protect my working conditions and connect their struggles with others. But I'm a tenured, promoted full-time faculty member. I am the least likely person at my institution to face any kind of workplace danger, consequence, problem, whatever. I have a
Mhm.
lot of status, and most of us, like this is, the dirty secret, not so dirty secret, I don't think, in North America. If you get a tenure track position, you are more than likely, unless you fuck up big time, to get tenure. But if you can't crack that that nut, if you can't get a tenure track job, and they are becoming increasingly rare, then you end up, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, Scott, like incredibly precarious within the academic space, right?
Mhm.
So we have kind of this class of worker who is really enjoying great benefits for most of us, even those of us who I work hard. I carry my weight. I do a lot for students in my department, but my gig as gigs go is a good one and is a protected one. And um, my concern is that just like many other fairly privileged unions elsewhere, is that as workers and as activists, we paid a lot of lip service to a lot of struggles, and we've done practically very little to make sure that we are creating the conditions for our own junior fellows, travelers, colleagues to follow us. So I would say this to every unionized academic in Canada who's got a tenure track job. How aggressive have you been in promoting graduate programs and recruiting graduate students? And how aggressive have you been in making sure that there will be jobs for them to occupy once they're done? And that kind of status, that kind of nest feathering that comes with running grad programs is something that almost every academic is socialized into seeing as worthy without ever wondering whether there will be jobs on the other side of that for those students who have been made promises to and some who are incredibly gifted. I'm not laying that at the feet of unions exclusively, but I think in our zeal to connect our struggles with ever more and usually like, in a very predictable fashion, ever more remote, abstract, high-minded, but often very like decontextualized struggles. So yeah, I am certainly concerned about climate justice, but I think a lot of this activism ends up being very gestural, very performative, and actually doesn't really amount to very much practically. So my question is in it, like if you are spending your time, your energy, your social capital kind of making these connections, trying to draw people into a larger struggle around Palestine, around indigenous issues here, those are all super important and worthy. But what is a similar uh, expenditure of energy in your own workplace in order to build that kind of consciousness, in order to build something beyond a professional association that is interested in making sure that its next contract looks better than its previous one. Um, that uses all the language. I mean, academics are super like savvy people, Lots of white collar unions are like this. It's like we
Mm,
learn to speak to justify our own interests
mm,
using the language of solidarity and social uplift. And I'm not trying to be super cynical about this, but I got to be honest. I'm almost 50 now. I've spent more than a couple of decades as a professor, first as a contract one, and then as a tenure track, and eventually a tenured one. And I can say with great confidence that I respect my colleagues, but I've seen an awful lot of virtue signaling over the years, where our status, our identity as academics is kind of symbolically mobilized in defense of struggles that are very self-referential and very much
yeah.
about our own space. And yeah, that's I mean, our context here in Nova Scotia is such a good one. Look at the universities, look at how many there are, look at the similarities in workplace issues. I mean, I was just at St. FX doing an external review a few weeks ago of their anthro department. It was like looking in a mirror, where like, why are we not talking? Why are there not conversations? Why is there
Absolutely.
not an idea of actually building a union that isn't just about a workplace organization, but is actually about a federation of locals that is beyond what we already have, which is just about dues paying and like mandate passing, but actually about recognizing that we are workers doing the exact same job across different institutions, and that hiving us off is precisely what makes us competitive against each other and vulnerable. I mean, you can look at the case of like Dalhousie. To me, has always been the sterling example, right? Uh, they're the biggest, so they exert the most pressure. But when it's time for that union to step up and support other institutions, I mean, Dal's Faculty Association will not even participate in the provincial ANSA organization, which is supposed to bring together all the university labor organizations. Again, not in a hierarchical fashion to pass binding resolutions, but just as a way to collaborate. It just gives away once again the fact that, like in the corporate world, it is the biggest players with the most members. drawing the most dues in the places with the most status that get their squeaky wheels oiled, and the rest of us are left to fight over the scraps.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that way. That atomization is no threat to the system whatsoever. It just reproduces it. And I've often felt like the university, was collapsing largely in on itself
Hmm.
precisely because of the ways that it just is so sealed off, right?
Hmm.
There's this real kind of
Exactly.
protectivism that I guess is rooted in the history you're talking about, this medieval history, this
Hmm.
feeling that it is this august institution that must be
Hmm.
preserved. And then also this scarcity, the scarcity mindset and the
Hmm.
desperation, right? So like the solutions, it feels like are straightforward in a sense. You need more and sustained public funding. You need transparent hiring practices, and you need
Hmm.
like improved labor standards. You need precarious part-time faculty to feel valued, to feel recognized,
Hmm.
to feel like they participate in the life of the university. And, I love what you're saying in terms of this federation kind of mentality, just like trying to build some kind of collective power and getting out of that scarcity mindset because um, the university remains an important social location. I mean, like, there are
Hmm.
many, many radical theorists who will say, like, because of its financialization, it doesn't feel like liberation or anything like it could ever come from it. I've heard you say something along these lines,
Hmm.
but it's still an important social
Hmm.
location. If you have to communicate to someone, like a parent, for example, that's trying to send their kid away to school, why neoliberalism, financialization, and all of these things erodes the quality,
Hmm.
measurably erodes the quality of their kids' education. Like, what would you say are the things, the like main, top of mind things that come to mind for you in terms of what is
Yes, I
threatened?
mean, so many, so many.
Yeah.
I think the first point I would make is the point that I think you're already speaking to so well, which is that um, people, especially the most precarious and underserved within the institution, the workers in this case, end up feeling incredibly resentful, beaten down, and broken by the labor they're doing and the lack of respect they receive from their colleagues and the institution, which poisons any workplace. Like, I don't have to tell you. I mean, I think that we see this time and time again. I see this kind of resentment amongst contract faculty, amongst full-time faculty, and especially amongst part-timers, and it's very much justified. But I think like one thing that I do wish people would take seriously is like this isn't about talking people into giving them a good pep talk and getting them to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This kind of endemic culture and experience of meagerness, of precariousness, of clock punching. It is a direct attack on what education in a liberal society is supposed to be about. Uh, I never make like ridiculous high-minded appeals to anybody anymore
You're a
about
materialist, yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I do think absolutely as somebody who's had the privilege of working with, folks, in my capacity as a teacher, as a mentor, like I mean, there's so much that goes on in the classroom that is incredibly like beautiful, empowering, exciting, where you're bringing students into contact with skills and ideas that, however they're going to mobilize them, like are actually like concrete uh, uh, tools that are concrete ideas, concepts, and skills that they can take out into the world with them. That's like nothing to be minimized. And in fact, obviously, as so many have pointed out, this is like super important to recognize in this context too, that even as public institutions like the university have become increasingly threadbare and been defunded and all this kind of stuff, they actually are seeing more people passing through their doors than we did decades ago, right? So the university in that way has become a more central cog, at least in the operation of modern liberal democratic societies and modern capitalism, than we really give it credit for, even in our most cynical moments, right? So I think one thing to recognize is if we're going to acknowledge that this skill building, this credentialing is essential to the future of the next generation of workers, then ought not that experience to be good for them, to be exciting, to be engaging, to be high quality? Or are we really just admitting that like the conventional and very dystopian anarchist critique of education is that it's just a prison, right? Are we admitting it's just a prison? Is that what our leadership in the society in our like is that what we're saying? And I think we really are kind of like at that moment where either we're going to commit to institutions that at least attempt to live up to their mandate and to the like the hope that at least some of us have put in them, or we're going to admit that they're holding pens for people until we're ready to make use of them. And if they're holding pens, then I think that there's very little incentive for people to self-select into that and to pay tuition to go to these places. So we're basically admitting that we're in the final stage of life of the university as it is, and that we're simply the struggle is then to imagine what lies beyond it. And there are days where I think that that is sort of where we'd be better off being. I mean, I don't know whether that's just me being caught in the jaws of it too much and being frustrated with it, but I do think about that a lot. I think that sometimes we have to acknowledge that the roots of our institutions lie deep in soil not of our own cultivation or making, and that sometimes our attempts to even radically reform them fail because the DNA of those spaces is so deeply encoded. And like, I do think this about the university, perhaps over and above other institutions, that yeah, we like it's caught in the teeth of this double bind. On the one hand, you have this like what is basically an authentically medieval structure of status and power that has remained like guild-like, enclosed, self-referential, self-governing, entirely inwardly directed, allegedly dedicated to the pursuit of like esoteric and abstract values, like the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, all these kinds of things. So you have that on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have the most aggressive, bean counter oriented form of austere neoliberal capitalism that is mandated with organizing and running it. And those two things like run into each other like this. And the problem is not that one deserves to win over the other, but that they're both rotten. Like that medieval
I
structure
mean, you have a
is,
good point here,
and I
What are
see
we
this
fighting to preserve? What
right.
exactly are we fighting to preserve,
I mean, there are days when I feel like I am honestly being invited to participate in a fight that is about my own unearned privilege. I'm like, am I really interested in sort of engaging in activism that's about circling the wagons around my status? Like that's sometimes when I hear very well-intentioned faculty representatives talk about labor, and I'm talking now about full-time tenured people in universities, not about precarious workers. But when I hear us describe ourselves or defend our mandate, there is this incredible sense of that kind of like, um, yeah, we are suffering because we are special, because we have been
interesting.
invested with this like mandate, but
Mhm.
that's an alibi, like what are we actually doing in terms of meeting the possibility of democratizing education in a society that so clearly craves it, um, what are we doing in terms of mobilizing expertise in ways that meets the demands, needs, and interests of people in community? What are we doing in terms of actually um, living up to our high-minded rhetoric about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, justice for historically marginalized people, addressing the fact that the university remains a key R&D node for capital and for many of our most egregious forms of social surveillance and control. Um, like, what about all that stuff? Where's the conversation around those things? And to my mind, that's all faded away in the last few years, especially because, understandably, of this really aggressive attack on the funding model. But the funding model is only supposed to be like the support system for the thing itself. So what is the thing itself that
What
we
is the
are?
thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the
What?
machine? What kinds of knowledge practices does it engage in? This is something that I ran into, I like where this conversation is going. It's straying to some extent from like
Mm,
talking about like academic labor action, but here, it's about asking yourself the question of what you're willing to give up.
mhm,
Like Gary Hall says, like, are you willing to leave the safe harbor of
yeah.
all of these, like, all of the comforts and incentives and the kind of esteem that is generated by this
Hmm.
position? And obviously, folks like that are trying to kind of encourage us to do so, but um, yeah, I think. Oh man, you've got me sort of spinning. What I wanted to kind of connect it to is this collective I'm part of called After Oil, which Darren Barney in particular, who teaches I think at Concordia, um, or maybe McGill, he talks about the need for people in the university to understand their complicity with fossil fuel companies and energy companies
Hmm.
and their the ways in which we perpetuate this carbon intensive way of living. And that
Hmm.
got me thinking about how like universities, not unlike energy companies, imagine themselves as just a permanent part of the landscape, as having a
Hmm.
right to exist, as almost having access to a kind of corporate immortalism where
Hmm.
you can't imagine another iteration of yourself or a permutation. But what you're suggesting is that another iteration of the university would be less stressful, more fulfilling, more crucially more connected and
Hmm.
solidaristic than it
Hmm.
is, because we
Absolutely.
are deeply siloed and
Yeah.
individualistic in
Oh
our
yeah.
work.
100%. Like
Yeah.
I mean, I would even say like this to me continues to surprise and amaze me that the logic of competitive and individual acquisition is so deeply baked into the like the repertoire, the disposition of the academic vocation that people will fight over things that literally cost them nothing, simply because they imagine every act of extending a hand to somebody else as making them vulnerable or giving something up. Like I would even say this, like I got tons of stories to tell, won't bore you about this, but would say that in the context of austere institutions like our own, try to get a conversation started with another small department about cross-listing courses or developing shared courses so that we can teach better and do more exciting things for
Yeah.
our students. Um, I've been involved in processes like that took me 2 years only to find out at the end that other people refuse to engage in acts that they don't see as directly and primarily serving their own academic units. Now, I'm not blaming them. We all have issues to address, like problems to work with in our departments. But I think this is one of the consequences when you have a class of worker who comes out of an experience in grad school where you are aggressively competing with peers for status, for grades, for awards. You come out, you are told that you are the consummate individual in some ways. You are professionalizing and developing your skill set yourself. You're on LinkedIn, you're networking, you work on your CV every other day, you've got the grant deadlines lined up, you're going to all those conferences, you're doing that, you're making that happen. After years and years of doing that, why would we think that the person who emerges on the other side of that training process would be solidaristic, would be selfless, would be committed to a common project that doesn't yield individual widgets, benefits, whatever commodities for sale in the intellectual market? It would make no sense, right? Like, and why we think that the modern university yields anything else? Like, I mean, this is just a personnel problem to some degree, right? And then where do managers in the university come from? Well, they come from the ranks of those very same people who are then promoted to deanships, to be vice presidents, and then so on and so on, right? So we have a very cloistered culture that, again, and I think like this, you could say this about a lot of workplaces, but the thing that makes it super poisonous in the university is because all these people have been very adeptly trained, at least those coming out of social sciences, humanities backgrounds, in an incredibly elaborate, convincing, and very moralistic vocabulary that invokes justice, invokes suffering, exploitation, inequality to defend and protect their own interests primarily. So I think that that has also produced an incredible degree of cynicism amongst people, quite rightly, who are observing this, students primarily, but also their families who see this going on within the institution, and then more broadly in society. So that when we do try to go out more broadly and mobilize what we imagine is that capital, right? We teach your children, we are invested in protecting the knowledge of this society and advancing it. Nobody believes it. And why should they? Because they know very well that the side that the bread has been buttered on is something that this class of worker has like really gotten good at doing, right? So I think that these things stand directly in the way of an authentic solidarity. I mean, it like this is the problem with our models of labor activism on campus right now. Is that it's become, first of all, it's an entirely predictable ritual. It seems to me, I would say, like on the basis of some pretty consistent observation, that neither the employer's side nor the union side shows up to negotiate when contract negotiations begin. They wait for conciliation, right? For the declaration of the moment where the union is ready to once again hold its largely performative strike vote, because anybody who's a good union member knows you vote yes to the mandate, and the employer knows that the mandate's coming. These things become ritualized rather than effective tactics. When we
Hmm.
know that this is, so what's the next step? Well, the next step then becomes, okay, so conciliation inevitably fails because both sides understand their power lies elsewhere. The employer is waiting for the intervention of either the labor board, arbitrators, et cetera, or eventually the province, right? If you live in a conservative enough province like Alberta, maybe or Ontario, you'll be legislated back to work eventually. If the government is averse to that, what you get is this toxic pressure downward on the university, which never leads to anything good, which is that, oh, great, students will vote with their feet, go elsewhere, they will be really upset. There is a toxification of interpersonal relationships on campus following strikes and labor actions, as people can well understand. It seems to me that, like in lots of places, workers are pretty like decent about that. Once again, I think our prolonged adolescence as academics means that many professional academics are really bad at seeing it as a struggle over workplace power and instead feel hurt. And I think this results in all kinds of incredible pettiness that you hear about only in white collar workplaces. Again, it's like those surgeons at the QE2, those heart surgeons who were found to be throwing shit at each other in the middle of surgery because they couldn't get along. Like you would never hear, like, you don't hear about that at like the steel plant,
Right.
or somebody
Yeah.
working at Tim Hortons was throwing hot coffee on a coworker. But in the
Yeah.
university, you'll hear about that, right? That kind of like
Right.
the people behaving badly. And I think like all these things, I mean, these sound very like sort of segregated examples, but for me, what they come back to is like actually the absence of the thing that we're talking about, which is a consciousness of collective existence, of like, I am the same as other people who are selling their labor so they can not freeze and not starve. And that means that I am on their side. Like, I may not agree with every single thing they do, or I may not like them personally. That has nothing to do with it. What we should imagine is that we are engaged in a collective struggle over who gets to call the shot, you know? And what we're doing in fighting each other for those crumbs is making sure that we will never be those people. It will never be us. And so I really think that the kind of possessive individualism that has, I mean, it really defines academia. Go to any conference, listen to how many people ask a question Like ask a real question at the end of a presentation instead of waiting for their chance to speak, right? Or framing what is a nasty comment as a question, right? Think about that. Like, where do people go in order to prove how smart they are or to score points versus what kinds of people actually show up to something and ask an honest question about something they don't understand? All those ritualized forms of socialization, engagement, affect and infect our forms of organizing outside of our professional lives. This is why white collar professional unions have become dramatically ineffective, I'd say, and why the ruling class knows very well that they are the ones that are easier to break because they're in it for themselves. And so, like this is how you mobilize one union against another, right? And I'll use the example of Dalhousie again. Um, Dalhousie's faculty years back were faced with the reality that the rest of us in the province now have to accept, which is that our pensions are they're just mutual funds, right? They're like, I
Yep.
don't know, I sure invest in it, but I'm hoping that the market doesn't crash before I'm old enough to enjoy it. Dal profs enjoy guaranteed pensions as a result of the province. The province underwrites it as they used to for public sector workers. Why the difference? Well, the difference is status and cred, right? So you're at Dow, you must be a better academic. You must have earned that position. You're at the Mount. You're at CBU. You're at St. Anne. You know, and imagine how
The
part-timers
market's
feel.
mercy. Yeah,
Yeah, and
that's
imagine
bizarre.
how part-timers feel confronted with that. Even for me to say,
Sure.
"Oh, my pension," right? I have colleagues on part-time contracts who have worked for years and years, as long as I've been working, who have nothing to look forward to basically in that way except what they pay towards in CPP. And like that's a significant and astounding and just in an institution
Yeah.
that proclaims its fealty to social justice.
Right. I mean, there's like
Like,
there's the moment in the documentary Capitalism is the Crisis where I
mm,
think it's Slavoj Žižek who says the new reality is one in which we are supposed to be grateful to be
mm,
exploited. Like,
mhm,
please exploit me.
yes,
And this is
precisely.
sort of the situation you're describing where like you might have issues with your pension, but you're supposed to simply be grateful that you
That
got an
it exists
academic
at all.
job.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then you can't even begin to politicize like how those pension funds are being spent, right? The politics of whether they're going to Elbit systems or
Hmm.
wherever. Like
Hmm.
you can't even begin to have that conversation because you're still at this kind of the system chills itself, right? Like
Hmm.
there's a way in which like we, have internalized these things that prevent us from actually feeling comfortable,
Yep,
raising broader questions about like
absolutely.
how just our jobs are, right? Yeah, there's just a million things that we could still talk about. I mean, a number of things you've been talking about in terms of like the professional managerial class and its
Hmm.
kind of abstraction of itself into this rarefied place reminds me a lot of a conversation I just had with the authors of a book called The Sustainability Class, where
Hmm.
they're talking about the professionalization of the climate movement.
Hmm.
And from their perspective, it's like the same deal where you
Hmm.
really attenuate and like decelerate any real radical momentum
Hmm.
because of the fact that you're, forcing people to, as you say, fight for scraps, right?
Yeah.
What kind of university would we have if we didn't just find each other in these moments of collective struggle briefly, but kind of met on a continuing basis to sort of forge a new,
Hmm.
healthier institution for our
Hmm.
students, but also for society at large. That's not
Yeah.
the model we have, but you articulate so perfectly, I think, like the kind of model we could have were we to, but it's where I see you kind of sitting. I don't know if this is fair, is between like, do we burn it down and
Mm.
build something new? Or is it possible to rehabilitate these unions to make them serve more of a collective purpose?
I mean, yeah, and I think there was a long period where I was happy to kind of dance around and say burn it down, in all honesty. I think whether it's age or just my own, my own experience or my own complicity, I'm less fond of that. I feel like it's kind of too late in the day to be so cavalier about institutions and their resources. Like far better to reclaim it than to have to destroy it and then dig through the rubble for what you can win back, you know? I think there's a lot of good still in many of our modern institutions, as imperfect as they are. And I think the university we would regret incredibly. I think those of us who feel that it is far less than it could be if we just turned our backs on it and just walked away or tried to burn it down, I think that would end up being a much more apocalyptic event than we'd like to think. So I'm definitely more on the side of reclamation with some burning involved. Um, but I do think that one of the questions, I would love to see this begin at the level um, of like where we really live our lives, right? Like, so rather than imagining sort of like what does the Federation look like, or what are these events that we're going to hold that will bring people together, let's really take stock of our own associations, unions, locals on campus. Like what is the nature of the executive and how they're elected? Like, what does democracy look like in my local? What kinds of things do we talk about? How often do we do that? Are we still doing them in the ways that we did 20, 30 years ago simply because that's what we become familiar with? Is that reaching people who are disaffected or who were never involved to begin with? Are we creating kind of ghettoized classes of workers who are formally exiled from the union more or less because they don't share the gospel of the clique who is currently running the show? And um, I think these little things that we begin asking, in terms like if our commitment is to revitalizing our organizations, and I think we'd be remiss to abandon our unions, obviously. Like, let's begin with that question. Like, if I'm unhappy, and I am in a lot of ways, like the question for me has to be not how can I cause the most trouble for my fellow members, but like what is the process that I would like to see in terms of turning that around and re-engaging people and revitalizing it? Like, I don't think this question of engagement is just superficial nonsense. I think, if we talk about community engaged research, community engaged teaching, like that can sound like a buzzword, but it can also point to something quite liberatory and powerful. Like if we took that serious, like what would like an education that we were committed to deinstitutionalizing and bringing to community in ways that would actually engage people's interests and their desires and their imagination. Like, what would that look like in a non-campy way, not in a way that we're trying to like sell something and make it a flagship event and then brand the university on the basis of it, but sincerely, quietly, carefully over the long term, how could we cultivate relations of education, support, feedback from the community that would make us accountable in real ways? Because right now, I mean, like there are lots of initiatives like that going on in the university, but none of them are accountable to the communities that they seek to address. They're all about drawing the community in and especially trying to win the tuition that comes as a result of that. Like, let's be clear, right? This
Yeah.
is this is what we're talking about. So too, I think with faculty with labor unions on university campuses right now, and especially faculty ones, I would say, like, what is the vision of research and teaching and service to the community that ought to underwrite a collectively oriented, solidaristic, and justice-seeking profession? Like, let's just begin there and like drop all the rhetoric around that. Like, let's ask that question. Like, how many people could this institution employ, and how many does it need? What about those incredibly privileged positions like Canada Research Chairs, which allow some faculty to do almost no labor of sustaining the institution, allegedly because they're so much better than the rest of us, right? You and me, Scott, we're never CRCs, but other people are. They like this kind of inequity. Like, I think, again, for people outside of the institutions, they're like, what are you even talking about? But it's like a reproduction in the microcosm of the inequalities we see produced more broadly by our very institution, the elevation of certain individuals and their very specialized, often very esoteric knowledge products above and over others that allows them to consume resources and exert force that is entirely disproportionate to the effects they even leave behind. How many, like if the question is training and social uplift, then prove it. If you can't prove it, then maybe the resources that go to feeding those very high profile streams ought to be brought into question. I want to live in a society where we can actually ask the question, like how many rich people can we afford and how many do we need? Not because I want to kill them, but because I want to ask the question about resources.
Yeah.
But I also want to extend that then to this question of faculty. And when I ask other faculty members who are always talking about their grad programs, I'm like, and what have you done to ensure that the students you have promised and are training will have jobs like yours, not just a job, but jobs like yours coming out the other side? Like faculty unions have no sense of that. Look at other industries. There is a commitment to ensuring jobs, at least for future generations of workers. I have never heard that conversation at a single faculty union meeting I've ever been in, or at any federation meeting I've ever been in.
So it
It,
seems so counterintuitive, right? Given that you
yeah,
could immediately, very visibly boost the value of your program by being able to demonstrate that you do have this like
and
hub that you've
that you're
created, right?
committed to it, yes, and that you're
Yeah.
putting resources and time behind it. But
Yeah.
of course, the academic, like the way that status and cred are won is never in those areas, right? Like you're not gonna win your next promotion or
Sure.
get course relief for doing any of those things, or get the accolades that will come to you from colleagues.
Hmm.
Instead, you will win those by those, like individualized, esoteric, and very often exotic knowledge commodities that most of the world can't access because they're way behind paywalls, but also they would have no interest because it makes no difference to their daily lives, right? So again, this question of like who we are, how we are made accountable to the people who like we are, like, not just living alongside of and teaching and learning from and all these sorts of things, but all of those other workers, as you pointed to the example with the oil industry. Like I turn my computer on and, electricity powers it. I come into my office and it's clean. My classroom is relatively well maintained, like just like tiny examples, but like this incredible invisible network of labor that underwrites all of this. And then, of course, all of the shot calling that goes on above that in terms of how provincial elites and federal ones identify priorities for post-secondary education, and then us, the willing, army, like looking to exemplify it. So what happens when we disagree with those priorities? What happens when we think those priorities are antisocial or directly opposed to the mandates of our professions and institutions? Well, not very much. We simply find ways actually to make ourselves useful to power. This is like courtiers, like in feudal times. It's sort of like the vocation of the academic today is to make sure you're as useful to people in power as possible. And I think that has had a very damaging effect on our independence, except when it comes time to proclaim it in order to defend some unearned privilege, of course, when we're always happy to defend our excesses through claims of academic freedom and integrity. But I think, like, yeah, are you willing to be regular? Are you willing to be common? Are you willing to like hang out with folks who are not part of your social class and who don't eat fancy desserts and don't like, watch art house films, but instead are just, people, right? Like, how many of those do you even know? Like, I think what's striking is that there, you can be kind of an elite in a lot of other areas of work and actually find yourself amongst people who are pretty uh pretty varied. But the academic social circle and the way that it is reproduced intergenerationally by class or class politics is, I think, incredibly pernicious. I think if you go around right now and ask and just do a totally non-scientific survey of working academics who are either in tenure track or tenured positions and ask them what their parents did, you're not going to find anybody, or at least like vanishingly few, who come out of anything but white collar professional households. I think that's a huge problem. I think that's a way bigger problem than our performance of identity politics that universities have become so eagerly committed to. You can have lots of people who look lots of different ways, who are attracted to lots of different people, who formally proclaim lots of different sort of identity-based differences, but who all come from the same social class, who experience the world materially in exactly the same ways, who come often from the ruling strata of their own societies if they come from away. And so what's much more relevant to my mind is that they come from that expectation of power and control rather than the differences, melanin content, ability, disability, sexuality, gender, identity, these kinds of things, which obviously, like, I'm not trying to deny them. I'm not saying they're red herrings, but I think universities, like, and it's in part why I think EDIA has become such a central and overriding concern to so many within the university, because it's another thing you can do to elaborate a bureaucracy around that can employ you and can employ people like you in creating and reproducing these mandates, ideologies, practices that actually do nothing to address social suffering, that do nothing to redistribute resources to communities and individuals who have been denied them for very unjust reasons, but do everything to constantly center your own expertise, your own view of the world, your own entirely non-cutting edge lifestyle. Because yeah, if my dad was a lawyer and my mom was a dentist, and I always came up expecting that I was going to live that lifestyle, um, my understanding of what other people experience is going to be necessarily limited, right? And I don't
And
think
yet
that's any.
it's, yeah. I know, I agree with you that this is like, if we wanted to diagnose why the university seems rotten in both its like financial facet and its medieval facet, I think, what you're talking about, this intergenerational reproduction of a certain impermeable
Hmm.
subjectivity, right? It's all about the kind of, self-made sort of
Hmm.
autonomous individual that rejects interdependency.
Hmm.
Pointing to that makes a lot of sense to me, and yet bringing it up in polite society is quite taboo, right?
Oh yeah.
It's
Oh,
super uncivil to start talking about class, especially, ironically, in
absolutely.
EDIA
Oh my
environments.
God, Scott, 100%.
You can't talk about how much money people make or point
Oh.
to psychological studies that suggest your core values are determined by
Hmm.
your income in many ways,
Yeah.
because you're alienating people, and that's somehow against solidarity, when in fact what we're suggesting is like this prior kind of class hierarchy and structure is making solidarity kind of unthinkable in a lot of
Yeah.
these contexts, and especially in the
100%.
university.
And I mean,
So
just that
yeah.
question, just like asking that question, I think this is the question that I wish, certainly within the university, more te full-time tenured people were curious and committed to, but also just in the general context of labor organizing right now, just that drilling home that like what we want is to identify and build and then defend at the cost of our very lives a dignified floor upon which everyone in society is entitled to stand, not the maximization of your individual brand
Exactly.
or your like your act or your shtick or whatever. It's like it's no accident that somebody like Rachel Dolezal, for example, in the United States, the infamous um, faker of racial identity thrived and was totally undetected in the academy and in rarefied white collar workplaces like NAACP organizing. Like that's exactly the kind of space where people would feel it's taboo to even ask that question. Oh, I'm not sure, but she seems like, and oh, she says all the right things, and her vocabulary, her presentation of self. I've been in rooms surrounded by people of different genders, sexualities, and skin tones, but all of whom come from like a ruling class position. That to me matters so much more. And I say that entirely unapologetically now. I think we are distracted by these issues. It's not that they're not important, it's just that I think in a truly free society, we would actually have far less latitude to shit on other people about those dynamics
Hmm.
if what we had was material security for people so that they weren't endlessly finding ways to grind their axes against those same people.
Yeah.
That's what the material incentive is. So I wish,
Hmm.
like my own union, one of the reasons allegedly we went on strike a couple of years ago was because the university wouldn't decolonize the collective agreement. I have no idea, Scott, what decolonizing a collective agreement involves. To me, collective agreements are entirely like, isn't that a settler legal? Like, did indigenous
It
nations
feels
have
like a
collective agreements?
contradiction in
Yeah,
terms.
it,
Yeah.
it it seems like a distraction. It seems like performance. And I'm sorry if I'm offending people with that comment. Like, I have to, but I mean, really, rather
It's a
than saying,
critique of strategy.
yeah,
What is your
but
strategy,
I
right?
mean, like, how about saying, yes, we acknowledge that our institutions, and perhaps us at the Mount, particularly given that the Sisters of Charity physically ran a residential school right up
Yeah.
into the 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe our commitment is to provide so many tuition-free placements for Indigenous students in this province and simply to get them through the doors, like to support them in terms of like lowering those bars that we know are actual bars, rather than saying, well, don't worry, we know you can't come here because you can't afford it, but we decolonized our collective agreement. So
Yeah, I mean, like, I appreciate you making the time, Alex, and sharing your insight. I think, I had a conversation with Nora Loreto on this
mm,
same subject, and she has these two books, Corporate Control and The
mhm,
Social Safety Net. And I think in writing those books, she reached a point where she was incredibly cynical about this
mm,
managerial class, right? The
mhm,
executive.
mhm,
And one of the things I really appreciate is how, not that she isn't, more, she's super nuanced in her thinking about all of it,
mhm,
but what I like is that I'm left with a productive sense of the messiness of all of
mhm,
this, right?
mhm.
That there aren't heroes and villains here. There
Exactly,
is a deeply dysfunctional system
exactly.
that we need to, yeah, act
Yeah.
back on in order to
Absolutely. And I
change.
think I would like to think that was so well said, Scott. And I think I would like to think that that actually should be a source of hope, right? That messiness,
Sure.
that lack of like heroes and villains means that people should like get off their asses, especially people like me, those of us ensconced in fairly secure positions right now, be less pessimistic, be less nightmare, doom and gloom, and actually go to work in the spaces where we still can exercise, build relationships between individuals in the institution who are willing to work together outside of the institution in terms of constituencies and communities who are excited about these opportunities, and start to put together the real relationships. Like just start with having conversations with people about these issues and ideas outside of the curated spaces of the employer or even the union that are like encouraged and allowed, right? And I think we will find each other in those spaces. And I have a lot of hope for people's willingness and ability to work together for something new.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a bunch.
Always a pleasure, Scott. Thanks so much.